So after Stalin dies, a new Soviet leader comes along with this big idea of peaceful coexistence. But here's the question we're tackling today. Did this really lead to a thaw in the Cold War, or was it just, a new strategy in this same old conflict? Let's dive in and really evaluate how successful this policy actually was.
All right, here's our game plan. We're going to start with the big shift after Stalin, then look at the evidence for a real thaw. After that, we'll get into the crises that kept things, well, pretty icy. We'll touch on the terrifying nuclear arms race, and then, at the end, we'll weigh it all up and deliver a final verdict.
And just to set the stage, let's hear from the man himself, Nikita Khrushchev. He laid out the stakes pretty clearly back in '56. For him, the choice was simple. Either we figure out a way to live side by side, or we face total nuclear annihilation. I mean, this quote just perfectly captures the tension of this new age, right?
So what exactly was this policy? Well, peaceful coexistence was this idea that the two big opposing systems, communism and capitalism, could actually exist at the same time without blowing each other up. Now, this was a huge ideological shift. You have to remember, traditional Soviet thinking, which came straight from Lenin, basically said a violent clash between them was inevitable. It was going to happen. But Khrushchev was now saying, no, wait, communism can win through being better, ideologically, economically, not necessarily through force. And this new way of thinking, it was only really possible because of a truly seismic event in the Soviet Union, the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953. His death brought Khrushchev to power and kicked off a brand new and pretty uncertain era.
On the home front, Khrushchev launched this policy called de-Stalinization. In 1956, he gave this bombshell secret speech where he just laid into Stalin, condemning his crimes and his whole cult of personality. Khrushchev wanted to steer the country away from that brutal violence and get the Communist Party back to what he saw as its true path. This internal reform was absolutely crucial because it sent a signal to the whole world that maybe, just maybe, the era of Stalin's aggression was over.
And that internal shift really seemed to hint at a new approach to foreign policy too. So let's look at the case for a genuine thaw. Let's look at those moments where it felt like diplomacy and dialogue were actually breaking through the ice.
But, okay, the path to a thaw was definitely not a straight line. While the Soviets were talking about coexistence, the United States, under its new president, Dwight Eisenhower, was taking a much harder line. Their policy wasn't just to contain communism anymore. It was to actively roll it back and liberate nations in Eastern Europe. So right from the jump, you have two completely different visions for where the world is headed.
And this wasn't just talk, not at all. U.S. policy was backed by two incredibly aggressive doctrines. First, massive retaliation, which basically meant that any Soviet move could be met with overwhelming nuclear force. And second, brinkmanship, the strategy of deliberately pushing a crisis right to the edge of war to make the other guy back down. These ideas don't exactly scream, let's all get along, do they?
But even with those aggressive policies in the background, there were some real diplomatic breakthroughs that gave people hope. In 1955, you had the Austrian State Treaty, where the Soviets in the West actually agreed to end their occupation and create a neutral Austria. That was a huge step forward. And then you get the Geneva Summit, the first time the big leaders had all met since World War II. And while they didn't sign any massive treaties, it created what everyone called the spirit of Geneva, a whole new atmosphere of communication and exchange. It felt like things were changing.
Yeah, but that spirit didn't last very long. So now let's flip to the counterargument and see how a string of intense crises quickly showed the very, very real limits of this coexistence idea.
In the exact same year as the hopeful spirit of Geneva, West Germany joins NATO. The Soviet response? It was immediate, and it was a major step backward. They formed the Warsaw Pact. This was a military alliance between the USSR and its Eastern European satellites. It essentially created a military mirror image of NATO, just hardening that division of Europe into two heavily armed camps.
And from there, the crises just came thick and fast. In 1956, Hungary tries to liberalize, and Khrushchev sends in the tanks, brutally crushing the uprising. This showed that peaceful coexistence definitely had its limits. It did not apply inside the Soviet sphere. And it also showed the U.S. rollback policy was just talk. Then, in 1960, the Soviets shoot down an American U-2 spy plane, exposing U.S. espionage and completely wrecking an upcoming summit. And finally, in 1961, the Berlin Wall goes up, a stark, concrete symbol that the Cold War was nowhere near over.
Now, lurking behind all of this political drama was a terrifying reality: the nuclear arms race. This was the ultimate paradox of the era. Everyone was talking about peace while simultaneously building weapons that could destroy the entire planet.
5,500 kilometers. That's the minimum range of an intercontinental ballistic missile, an ICBM. In August of 1957, the Soviets tested the world's first one. And just like that, for the first time ever, the USSR had a weapon that could drop a nuclear warhead right onto the United States. The whole game had changed.
And this quote from the historian John Lewis Gaddis just captures the psychological impact of all this perfectly. A few months after that ICBM test, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first satellite. And as Gaddis writes, this made the threat feel so incredibly real and personal. You know, Americans could literally just look up into the sky and see this little dot of light, a symbol of Soviet power passing right over their own homes.
Now, this whole race led directly to the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the closest the world has ever come to all-out nuclear war. But the crucial thing to understand here is that in that ultimate moment, when both sides were at the very brink, they both blinked. Faced with the reality of mutual assured destruction, the core idea of coexistence, which at its heart is about avoiding a catastrophic war, it won out.
Okay, so let's pull all of these threads together. We've seen moments of real cooperation, and we've seen moments of incredibly intense confrontation. So let's get to our final verdict and weigh the evidence. Was this a real thaw, or was it just a new tactic in an old war?
So let's lay it all out. On one side, in the thaw column, you've got solid diplomatic wins like the Austrian State Treaty and that Spirit of Geneva. Plus, you had the critical de-escalation during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But then you look at the freeze column, and man, it is heavy. You've got the Warsaw Pact, the brutal crackdown in Hungary, the U-2 incident, the Berlin Wall, and of course that terrifying ramp-up of the nuclear arms race.
So here's the bottom line. Peaceful coexistence wasn't really a genuine end to the Cold War. It was more of a strategic shift in how the Cold War was fought. It was both sides recognizing that in a nuclear world, a direct head-to-head military fight was basically suicide. The new battlefield was going to be about ideology, economics, and influence, anything and everything short of a war that would destroy them all.
And that really leaves us with one final big question to think about. Was Khrushchev's policy a genuine, noble attempt to build a more peaceful world? Or was it just the only logical strategy left when the alternative was, in his own words, the most destructive war in history? It's a question that really gets right to the heart of what the Cold War was all about.